The night I learned just how dangerous my mother-in-law could be began under the golden chandelier of her dining room. I remember the way the light glowed warmly over the long mahogany table, the porcelain dishes set with clinical precision, the crystal glasses filled with deep red wine that caught the flicker of the candles like blood in the dark. It looked perfect, flawless, but my stomach had been uneasy even before I took my seat, because nothing in this family ever truly was what it seemed. My name is Claire, and I was 29 years old when I married into the Harringtons. To outsiders, they were a picture-perfect dynasty, wealthy, elegant, poised. But from the moment I entered their world, I was reminded in 1,000 subtle ways that I did not belong. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, led those reminders with the kind of grace only a seasoned manipulator could master. She never insulted me directly, never raised her voice, never showed her disdain in public. No, she preferred little cuts, like reminding me that my family came from modest means, or that my degree in literature was romantic but not practical, always said, with that same calm smile that looked like kindness but felt like poison. That night she served me a salad. She placed it in front of me with her signature expression, lips pressed into a slight, unreadable curve, eyes flickering with an expectation she didn't bother to hide. This, she said, is a recipe I learned from a Michelin-starred chef. Something special. Just for you. The words were meant to be generous, but my instincts twisted. Something about the smell rising from the plate made my chest tighten. It wasn't rotten. It wasn't sour. But beneath the tang of vinaigrette was a sharpness I couldn't place. A chemical undertone. Too sharp, too wrong. I forced a smile. My husband Daniel was too deep in conversation with his father about stock portfolios to notice my hesitation. Across the table, his sister Vivian was already halfway through her portion of salad, eating daintily, basking in her father's praise for some recent success at work. She had always been the golden child, the mirror of her mother's perfection, the pride of this carefully curated family. She glanced at me with that smug little tilt of her chin, as if even the way she swallowed lettuce proved she was better than me. Eleanor was watching, always watching. I twirled a forkful of the glistening leaves, pretending to admire the colors, the pomegranate seeds, the slivers of almond. My throat felt dry. My pulse raced. Something inside me screamed, "Don't eat it." And in that moment, instinct outweighed politeness. I shifted in my chair, pretending to adjust my napkin. My plate slid forward just slightly, brushing against Vivian's. My fingers, steady with a kind of cold courage, flicked the porcelain just enough for the plates to trade places under the cover of casual movement. Vivian didn't notice. Of course she didn't. She was too busy talking about herself. But Eleanor noticed. Oh, she noticed. Her gaze lingered on me for a fraction too long, her eyes narrowing just slightly before her mask of warmth slipped back into place. I smiled at her, a deliberate mirror of her own game. And then I lifted my fork not to eat what she had served me, but what Vivian had just finished. The taste was ordinary, crisp, tangy, harmless. I chewed slowly, my eyes locked on Eleanor's. For the first time I saw her composure crack, just slightly, a tightening of her jaw, a flash of something behind her eyes. Calculation interrupted by surprise. And then minutes later, Vivian began to cough. At first it was nothing, just a polite clearing of her throat, but then her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water. Her face paled. A thin sheen of sweat appeared along her hairline. She coughed again, harder, her chest heaving as she pressed a trembling hand to her stomach. Daniel turned to her, alarmed. "Are you okay?" Vivian tried to smile, to brush it off, but her voice cracked. It's fine, just spices." But it wasn't spices, I knew it. Eleanor knew it. And when Vivian shoved back her chair with a screech of wood against floorboards and bolted from the room, clutching her stomach as retching echoed down the hallway, the entire table fell silent. I lifted my water glass, took a slow sip, met Eleanor's eyes, and smiled. "Delicious salad. You must share the recipe." Her hand, elegant as ever, tightened just a fraction around her wineglass stem. Her face remained calm, but her eyes betrayed her. For the first time since I had known her, she looked rattled. That was the moment I understood she hadn't just tried to embarrass me, hadn't just played another of her petty little dominance games. She had wanted me gone. Out of her son's life. Out of her perfect family portrait. Maybe even dead. And now, by some twist of fate, or by my own instinct, her scheme had landed on her beloved golden daughter instead. The silence after Vivian left the table was suffocating. No one spoke. My father-in-law cleared his throat, pretending to readjust his napkin, his eyes betraying the discomfort he would never dare voice. Daniel hovered between standing and sitting, torn between going after his sister and waiting for permission from his mother. And Eleanor. Eleanor sat still, her mask fragile now, her silence sharper than any words. I should have been horrified. I should have been afraid, but all I felt was vindication. Because in that single exchange of plates, the balance of power had shifted, and Eleanor knew it. The sound of Vivian vomiting in the guest bathroom echoed down the hall like a grotesque reminder of what had just happened. Daniel finally rushed after her, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, but Eleanor did not move. She sat perfectly still, her back straight, her fingers interlaced neatly on the tablecloth, her face painted in a mask of controlled serenity. Only her eyes betrayed her two sharp points of ice that locked onto me unblinking. I had spent years being intimidated by those eyes. But that night, for the first time, I held her gaze without flinching. Because I knew, and she knew I knew. The air grew thick, unbearable. My father-in-law fumbled for conversation, muttering something about business deals, but his words fell flat against the silence. Finally, Eleanor rose from her chair, her movement slow, deliberate, rehearsed. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice as smooth as silk and twice as suffocating. Then she left the table, her heels tapping rhythmically on the polished wood floor as she followed after her daughter. I remained seated, swirling the wine in my glass, pretending calm while my heart pounded like a drum inside my chest. My hands wanted to shake, but I forced them still, because showing fear would be handing her victory even now. When Daniel returned 20 minutes later, his face was pale. His tie loosened, his voice tight with concern. "She's resting," he said. "It must have been food poisoning." His eyes flicked toward me, searching for comfort, but I offered none. I couldn't, because even as he spoke, I could feel the weight of Eleanor's shadow behind every word. That night when we returned home, Daniel asked me if I had noticed anything unusual about the salad. My throat tightened. I thought of Eleanor's eyes, her brittle composure when I switched plates, the venom beneath her smile. I thought of the way my instincts had screamed at me to stop. But I shook my head. "No," I said softly, "it just tasted different." He nodded, accepting my half-truth. Because Daniel had always been that way, willing to believe the simplest explanation rather than face the storm brewing beneath. But I knew better. In the days that followed, Vivian's illness became the family's whispered scandal. She recovered quickly, too quickly, the doctors said, for it to be anything truly serious. But she never stopped complaining about the humiliation, the way her body had betrayed her, in front of guests, the embarrassment of being seen so weak. Eleanor soothed her with honeyed words, blaming bad produce, assuring her that no one would dare think less of her. Yet every time Eleanor's eyes met mine across a room, I saw the unspoken accusation, "You did this." And perhaps in a way I had, because if I had eaten that salad, it might have been me writhing on the floor. It might have been my humiliation, my destruction, or worse. The thought haunted me late at night when Daniel slept beside me, oblivious to the storm raging inside my mind. What exactly had Eleanor planned? Was it truly poison, or something subtler? Something meant to weaken me, embarrass me, make me look fragile and unworthy in front of the family. I replayed the moment again and again, the switch of plates. Her flicker of surprise, Vivian's sudden collapse, each time the same conclusion burned in my chest: Eleanor had meant harm. Weeks passed, but the unease never left. If anything, it grew heavier, a constant reminder that the balance of power had shifted, but not settled. She knew I had defied her. She knew I had survived. And women like Eleanor did not forgive defiance. The next test came at a family brunch 2 Sundays later. The table was set in the sunlit conservatory glass walls, reflecting the manicured garden beyond. Everything gleamed: silver cutlery, crystal bowls of fruit linen napkins folded like swans. Eleanor presided at the head of the table, elegant in a pale silk blouse, her hair perfectly coiffed, her expression unreadable. She poured tea herself that morning, something she had never done before. One by one, she served us her hands steady, her smile unwavering. When she reached me, she paused just a fraction too long, the porcelain cup hovering between her fingers and mine. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment the world shrank to the silent exchange between us. I took the cup, raised it to my lips, and then very deliberately set it down untouched. The corners of her mouth tightened just slightly before she moved on. Vivian, still fragile in her pride, noticed nothing. Daniel, too busy talking about work, didn't see. But Eleanor did, and she hated me for it. That afternoon, when the others went walking in the garden, she cornered me in the hallway. Her voice was low, her tone deceptively soft. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she whispered. I met her gaze, refusing to step back. "I think I'm alive," I replied. Her eyes darkened. For the first time, the mask slipped and I saw the fury beneath. Not just hatred, but fear. Fear of being exposed, fear of losing control. That was when I realized Eleanor wasn't just cruel, she was desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. From that day on, the battle was no longer hidden. It became a silent war, glances exchanged across rooms, barbed comments delivered under the guise of politeness, invitations to taste this or try that I declined with a smile. The rest of the family remained blind, caught in the web of appearances she wove so carefully. But I knew, and she knew I knew. I began keeping a journal, writing down every detail, every suspicion, every moment when the mask cracked. I needed proof not just for myself, but for the day when this war reached its climax. Because deep down I understood something chilling: Eleanor would not stop until one of us was destroyed. And I refused to be the one buried. The first entry in my journal was only 2 sentences long. "Trust your body. It knew before your mind did." I wrote it in the middle of the night with the bathroom light on and the fan humming because fear makes the quiet too loud. I had spent years dismissing the humbling wisdom of instinct in order to be polite, agreeable, palatable. But after the salad and the tea and the way her eyes tracked the rise and fall of my glass, I decided to treat my intuition like evidence. I would record everything: dates, times, menus, glances, the way her knuckles blanched around a stem of crystal. And then I would see if a pattern emerged. It did. 2 days after the brunch, I returned to the Harrington house, under the pretense of returning a scarf I had forgotten. Eleanor's housekeeper, Mrs. Nash, answered the door in her gray cardigan, her face pinched with a wariness that softened when she saw me. She liked me. I had been kind to her in a house that paid her to be invisible. "I'll just leave this for Mrs. Harrington," I said, raising the scarf. Then I lowered my voice, letting a tremor I didn't have to fake edge the words. "Actually, could I use the kitchen for a moment? I want to leave a note." Permission flickered in her eyes. She stepped aside. The kitchen, all marble and copper, and the faint antiseptic smell of wealth, was empty. I put the scarf on the island, and then, because instinct tugged, I opened the pantry door. Labels faced forward in militant rows. Vinegars in a regiment of glass, oils graded by color, a wooden caddy of tinctures I had never seen in any cookbook. The amber bottle on the far right had no label. This was odd in a kitchen where even the salt bore a provenance. I lifted it and unscrewed the cap. A medicinal scent, faint, bitter, almost floral, like crushed stems and metal. My body recoiled without my permission. "What are you looking for?" Mrs. Nash's voice was quiet, but it cut cleanly through the air like a knife. I turned, forcing my face into something open. "A notepad," I said, and then, because self-preservation sometimes tastes like honesty and answers. For a long moment we looked at each other over the island. She had worked here for 22 years. She had borne witness to things the wallpaper had learned to swallow. Her eyes softened first. "I'll make you some tea," she said. She did not ask what kind. She chose peppermint, soothing and sweet. When she set the cup before me, her hand hovered over the saucer as if she might take mine, and then thought better of it. "You aren't the first," she said at last, "to feel unwell here. Before you, there was Daniel's college girlfriend, the one who laughed too loudly, and a caterer at the engagement party who said the mousse tasted off and spent an hour lying on the cool tiles. Lady Harrington does not like surprises." "Did she?" I could not say the word poison. It was too medieval for this room. Mrs. Nash looked down at her clasped hands. I don't pretend to know, but there is always a bottle. And there is always a story afterwards about bad produce or delicate stomachs, and the world nods because it loves a pretty lie. She lifted her chin. Don't drink what she pours. Ever. Her warning rang inside my ribs like a struck bowl. I thanked her and left with my scarf and a memory of an amber bottle that I could still smell hours later. That evening, after Daniel fell asleep, I Googled ipecac syrup. The descriptions made my stomach flip, the bitter plant-like taste, the rapid onset of vomiting, the way a small amount could humiliate without lasting harm. The clinical cruelty of it made my skin crawl. I scrolled through old photos of Harrington parties in social magazines looking for anything I might have missed. In one from 3 years ago, a woman's face is turned away at the edge of the frame. Her hand clapped over her mouth, a waiter bending toward her with a cloth. The caption read only, "A flawless evening." I needed more than a hunch. I needed proof that would make Daniel see what his loyalty refused to let him see. So I set about collecting it the way I collect language, carefully, patiently, one verb at a time. I bought a small keychain camera and hid it in the silk lining of my clutch. I asked a pharmacist friend about at-home test strips and learned that they won't catch ipecac, but a laboratory could. I scraped what I could from the inside of the salad bowl I had taken from the brunch, under the pretense of loving the pattern, just a smear, dried and faint, and sealed it in a sterile container. I logged everything I did, because if there is one thing this family taught me, it's that memory is no match for a practiced denial. 2 weeks later, the laboratory report arrived in a plain envelope. I stared at the results until the black letters swam. Emetine alkaloids detected. The word traveled through me like ice melting, not guesswork, not paranoia. Evidence. I held the paper with both hands and felt the peculiar mix of dread and relief that comes when the fear you carried in your body is finally given a name. When I showed the report to Daniel, he frowned the way one frowns at a crossword clue that refuses to submit. His first sentence was a defense he must have rehearsed his whole life. My mother would never. His second sentence was the one little boys grow into when they want to stay safe. Maybe the lab made a mistake. It wasn't a mistake, I said, and because the truth sometimes needs a witness, I shared Mrs. Nash's story, the empty labels, the old photographs. He pinched the bridge of his nose and walked to the window and back, like a man trying to outpace a memory. You don't understand the pressure she's under, he said finally, small and tired. Everything has to be perfect. It's how she copes. The room tilted. I thought of Vivian, pale and trembling at the guest bathroom sink. I thought of the college girlfriend whose laugh had cost her an hour of shame on cool tiles. Perfection is not an alibi, I said. And coping is not a license. He did not answer. The silence between us wasn't a bridge anymore. It was a border. We went to bed without touching. I lay awake and listened to the house breathe. When he finally slept, I crept downstairs and opened my journal to a fresh page. I wrote, "Sometimes the people who say, 'That would never happen,' mean, 'I can't survive if it did.'" I began to watch Eleanor like a student of weather studies the sky. The next family event was the Hospital Foundation Gala. She chaired a night of white tablecloths and measured applause. I arrived early and walked the perimeter like security, which I suppose I was of my own life. I asked a waiter for a glass of water and tipped more than the dress I wore suggested I could. "Do you remember the Harringtons' private requests?" I asked lightly, as if private requests were napkin folds and not pressure points. He nodded toward the back. "Mrs. Harrington has a special dressing sent in from her home kitchen for her table. Said she can't trust the hotel kitchen not to overdo the garlic." I slid my phone into my clutch where the pinhole lens watched as I wandered toward the bustle near the service door. Through the cracked jamb, I saw a delivery bag with the Harrington crest. A small glass bottle sat uncorked beside it, amber unlabeled. A woman in a white jacket, a hired private chef I didn't recognize, piped something from a plastic squeeze bottle into a ramekin and whisked until it glistened. I took one photograph and then another. Not enough to indict. Enough to remember. At the table, Eleanor's eyes sparkled with the theatrics of a woman who knows precisely where the spotlight will fall. She floated through greetings, hand to shoulder, cheek to cheek, voice pitched exactly to make people lean in. When the first course was placed, she gestured magnanimously toward me. "Claire, darling, you must try the vinaigrette. It's heavenly." Later, I said with a smile that felt like showing my teeth. I lifted my napkin and let the camera gaze through my clutch. In the corner of the frame, I caught her hand as it hovered above my plate, a heartbeat too long. Later, when I slowed the footage, I would see the gleam of a drop separate from the lip of a glass bottle. At the table, I simply moved my plate an inch enough to catch her wrist in the act of stillness. Our eyes met. She did not blush. She did not flinch. She only smiled in that way that women weaponize when they've been told all their lives that rage is unbecoming. On the drive home, Daniel stared at the road as if it might tell him something he could live with. "You humiliated her," he said. "I protected myself," I replied. "There's a difference." He didn't speak again. The border between us widened until even the sound of his breathing on his side of the bed felt like a stranger's. The next morning, he texted that he would be staying at the club for a few nights to give everyone space. Everyone in this case meant his mother. The vacuum of his absence revealed things I might never have seen if he'd stayed. A message slipped under our door without a return address. "Check the drawer in her sitting room." I recognized the careful print of someone who has learned to be legible in a world that prefers them blurred. Mrs. Nash. Another ghost of the household staff. The note burned in my palm. That afternoon, with a key Daniel had given me the Christmas after our wedding, a key I learned was more symbolic than practical. I entered the Harrington house when I knew Eleanor would be away. The sitting room was a museum of restraint porcelain vases, arranged by height art books aligned like soldiers. The desk held a single silver pen and a stack of monogrammed cards. The drawer slid easily, empty. Instinct again, I pressed the wood at the back. A false panel popped loose with a sigh. Inside lay a cigar tin polished by years of touching. I opened it and found three things: a folded newspaper clipping from 1999, "Socialite falls ill at charity luncheon," "Officials cite stomach bug," a photograph of Daniel Young, and laughing with a girl I recognized from the article, and an amber vial with residue clinging to its lip like old honey. My hands shook hard then, not because the object surprised me, but because the room did not. Even the dust here was arranged. I slid my phone from my purse and photographed each item front and back, then replaced the panel and wiped my prints from the wood with the sleeve of my sweater. At home, I transferred the images to a folder labeled with a word I had earned the right to claim: safety. Then I sat in the dark of our den and pressed play on the footage from the gala, my finger hovering over the spacebar where I had learned to pause a life at the precise moment it revealed itself. When the frame caught her hand poised over my plate, I felt no triumph, only a long, low grief for the years I had modeled myself into a woman someone like Eleanor could not refute. It turns out the only way to win her game was to stop playing it. That night, while washing my face, I noticed my breasts tender in a way that felt familiar and distant. The calendar app confirmed what my body had been whispering under the noise: I was late. In the quiet of our bathroom, with the fan humming the way it had that first night, I watched a thin pink line appear on the test in my palm. My knees went weak, not with fear exactly, but with the crush of arithmetic. This is what she could have taken. This is who she might try to take now. I pressed a hand to my abdomen and sobbed once, a sound ripped from an old place in me where the wish for a family had served as both compass and wound. When the crying passed, a steadier thing took its place. Not hatred, not even anger, a promise. I texted Daniel that I needed to see him. His reply came hours later. "Busy tonight." Tomorrow, I stared at the glowing screen until it blurred. Then I typed, "I'm pregnant." The three dots blinked, disappeared, blinked again, then settled into a single sentence that told me everything I had not wanted to know. "We'll talk after I speak with Mother." I did not sleep. I lay awake with one hand on my belly and the other on the folder labeled Safety, and understood that the climax of this story was no longer optional. I would bring the report, the photographs, the footage, and the tin to the one place Eleanor could not choreograph: a lawyer's office with a recorder on the table and a clock that did not bend to her will. I would tell Daniel that this was the only conversation that mattered now, the one where a child's future was not a prop in his mother's theater. The one where he decided what kind of father he was capable of being. Morning brought a clean, indifferent light across the kitchen tile. I brewed tea and poured it down the sink, a small ritual of refusal that felt like prayer. I packed my journal and the lab results and the photograph of the girl from 1999 into my bag. Before I left, I opened the front door to a breeze that smelled like rain, deciding whether to fall. I stood there a long moment, hand on the knob, and listened for the part of me that still wanted to be small. She was quiet. In her place was a voice that had learned the difference between revenge and protection. The former is a fire you feed with your own furniture. The latter is a house you build so a child can sleep. When I reached the end of the driveway, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. If you are going to confront her, do it at the foundation board meeting. She won't expect witnesses. I didn't recognize the number, but I recognized the courage it took to send that text into the empire of a woman like Eleanor. I typed back only 2 words. Thank you. Then I turned the car toward the city, toward the meeting where the Harrington name polished donor walls, and imagined the sound a mask makes when it finally cracks on marble. The boardroom of the Harrington Foundation was as polished as the family's reputation. High ceilings, glass walls, leather chairs arranged around a mahogany oval. Outside, the city glimmered with its cold towers of steel, but inside everything smelled faintly of polish and perfume, as if even the air had been curated. I arrived 15 minutes early, the folder labeled Safety pressed against my ribs like a shield. Eleanor was already there. She stood at the head of the table, speaking softly to 2 board members, her posture regal, her pearls glowing under the recessed lights. When her eyes found me, her smile slid into place, smooth, controlled, dangerous. "Claire," she said warmly, as if my presence were a pleasant surprise. "You didn't have to come." "I did," I replied, my voice steady. The members greeted me politely, unaware of the storm gathering between us. They had known me as Daniel's quiet wife, someone who smiled in photographs and stayed out of speeches. But today, I was something else. The meeting began. Reports, funding allocations, the usual performance of wealth dressing itself as generosity. Eleanor's voice floated across the table, measured and commanding, every word rehearsed. She thrived in this space. It was her stage. But while she spoke, I opened my folder beneath the table and slid the photographs into view. The amber vial, the lab report, the image of her hand hovering over my plate. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I breathed through it, waiting. At last the agenda moved to new business. My moment. I raised my hand and the room turned. Eleanor's smile did not falter, but I saw the flicker of unease in her eyes. "Yes, Claire." I placed the lab report on the table, its header bold under the fluorescent light. "I have evidence that substances harmful to health have repeatedly been present in food served at Harrington family events. I believe this board deserves to know since it bears her name." A ripple of confusion spread through the room. One man coughed into his hand. Another leaned forward, squinting at the paper. Eleanor's smile froze. "This is outrageous," she said lightly, though her voice carried the faint tremor of steel bending under pressure. "Claire, dear, you must be mistaken. Some laboratories exaggerate findings. Surely you don't want to embarrass yourself." I laid down the photographs. The amber vial in her sitting room. The clipping from 1999. The footage still of her poised above my plate. It's not a mistake. And I'm not the only one. There are patterns, witnesses, records. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Eleanor's hand twitched against the table, the first true crack in her mask. One board member whispered to another. Papers shuffled nervously. "You misunderstand." Eleanor tried again, her tone softening, turning maternal, the same voice she had used to scold Vivian as a child. "Claire has been under stress. These inventions are her way of coping." We must be compassionate. No, I said louder now. My voice trembled, but it carried. Compassion is not silence. Silence is what allows harm to go on generation after generation. I won't be silent. I felt my hand on my belly, the small swell only I knew was there. The thought of that fragile heartbeat strengthened me. I straightened my back, feeling every eye on me, and I did not look away. The room shifted. Some members avoided Eleanor's gaze. Others glanced at the evidence again, doubt creeping into their carefully curated loyalty. Power. I realize doesn't vanish all at once, it erodes grain by grain when truth insists on being seen. Eleanor's face hardened. The smile was gone now, replaced by something raw and sharp. You don't know what you're playing with, she hissed under her breath, low enough only I could hear. You'll regret this. Perhaps I whispered back, but at least I'll be alive to regret it. The meeting ended in chaos. No formal vote, no decisions, just murmurs and sidelong glances as board members gathered their papers and left in uneasy silence. Eleanor remained at the head of the table alone now, her mask in shards. Daniel came to me later that night. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he held the photographs. Is it true? He asked, his voice hollow. All of this. I wanted to reach for him, to comfort him, but the years of denial between us stood like a wall. You've always known Daniel, I said softly. You just didn't want to see. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. What happens now? I touched my belly again, my voice steady. Now I protect what matters, with or without you. He didn't answer, and I knew then that the choice was his, but my path was already clear. Because Eleanor's reign was ending. The empire of appearances was cracking, and I, once the silent daughter-in-law, had become the witness she could not erase. The days after the foundation meeting felt unreal, as if I had stepped off the edge of a stage and landed in an entirely different play. Eleanor retreated into silence, but it was not the weaponized silence she had once wielded with such precision. This silence was defensive, brittle, the silence of a woman who realized that others were finally watching her, not with admiration, but suspicion. Rumors spread quickly through the board, then the city. Nothing appeared in the papers. Wealth can still buy discretion, but whispers slithered through charity circles, the kind of whispers that leave stains no one can ever quite scrub clean. Did you hear at the Harrington meeting something about food and poison and the daughter-in-law? People leaned in, lowered their voices, glanced nervously over their shoulders. For a woman like Eleanor, reputation was oxygen, and now her lungs were full of smoke. Daniel avoided me at first. He stayed away for several days, claiming business at the club, but I knew better. He was drowning in the wreckage of denial, unsure whether to cling to his mother or to the truth. When he finally returned, his face looked older, lined with the weight of choosing between loyalty and survival. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence thick. At last he spoke. She wants to see you. I almost laughed. To apologize? His eyes dropped. To negotiate? I shook my head slowly. There's nothing left to negotiate. I won't risk myself or our child. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. He looked up sharply, his face pale. Our child. I placed a hand on my stomach, the faintest swell under my sweater. Yes. For a moment, something soft flickered in his eyes. A glimpse of the man I had once believed in, the boy who had laughed freely before his mother's shadow taught him silence, but it vanished almost as quickly, replaced by fear. Then we have to keep the peace, he whispered. For the baby. No, I said, my voice firm, steady. For the baby, we have to choose truth, safety, a life not built on lies and fear. His silence was my answer. A week later, I moved into the cottage permanently. The air there felt cleaner, sharper, like it had been waiting for me to choose it. I filled its rooms with small things, flowers from the market cushions and colors Eleanor would have called gaudy laughter, from the women who gathered in the evenings to share their own stories of being diminished, silenced, erased. Holly's haven began quietly, just a circle of chairs around a fire, but it grew. Neighbors told neighbors, and soon the cottage was filled with voices that had been hidden too long. I told them pieces of my own story. Not the names, not the scandal, but the truth, that when you are told you are worthless long enough, survival itself becomes defiance. That refusing silence is not cruelty, it is salvation. They nodded, tears shining in their eyes because they knew. Daniel visited once. He stood on the porch, awkward in his expensive suit, staring at the peeling paint, the wild roses I had planted along the fence. "You look different," he said quietly. "I am," I replied. He hesitated. "She's not well. People are turning away. She blames you." "I'm sure she does," I said softly. "But one day she'll understand this isn't about me. It's about her choices." He looked at me, then really looked as if seeing me for the first time. But he didn't step inside. He left with a stiff nod, and I knew he had chosen his path. Months passed. My belly grew. The women who gathered at Holly's Haven became my family, their laughter, my music, their resilience, my strength. The cottage, once a vault of secrets, became a home of healing. And then one evening, a letter arrived. No return address, but I knew the handwriting immediately: sharp, elegant, controlled. Eleanor. I hesitated before opening it, my hands trembling. Inside were only 2 sentences written in her steady script. "You were never meant to survive me. But perhaps the child will. Do not come back." For the first time, her words did not wound. They freed me. I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the flames consume the last attempt at control she would ever have over me. And when the ashes scattered into the night, I felt something inside me settle. A peace I had not known in years. When my daughter was born, I named her Grace. Holding her in my arms, I realized the truest revenge had nothing to do with exposing Eleanor, or even with reclaiming my voice. The truest revenge was living a life untouched by her cruelty. The truest revenge was joy. I tell you this story now, not because I want pity, but because I want you to know silence is not safety, endurance is not love. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to look someone in the eye and say, "No more." So if you're listening, if you've ever been made to feel small, invisible, worthless, know this: you are not alone. Your voice matters, your story matters, and you deserve more than survival, you deserve peace. If this story touched you, if you saw pieces of your own life in mine, I ask you from my heart, please, like this video, share it so others might find courage, subscribe to hear more stories like this, and leave a comment with your own truth. Your voice belongs here. Because when we speak, we are not forgotten.